Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. He was the founder and leader of ISIS. We obliterated his caliphate 100%.
Back in 2019, a triumphant President Trump declared the Islamic State Caliphate destroyed. The group slowly faded from the daily news. But then, earlier this year, they showed the world that they hadn't gone away.
More than 100 people have been killed and scores of others injured in 2 explosions in southeastern Iran, in the city of Kerman. Well, with more on this, I'm joined now by the BBC Persian's Paham Gabadi.
This is one of the deadliest attacks in Iran in the past 40 years. It's been unprecedented. The death toll is rising every few minutes so far.
A few weeks later, this news came in from Moscow.
A rock concert that turned into a massacre. Thousands of people had gathered at the venue near Moscow when gunmen broke in and began shooting. Outside the hall, more casualties as the attackers gunned people down, apparently at random.
29th of June marks 10 years since the Islamic State group declared the establishment of a caliphate. In this episode, we ask, how much of a threat is IS today? I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, getting past the narratives, the propaganda, and the disinformation.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
In this episode, we'll try out something different. It's a discussion with experts from our jihadist media monitoring team, and the topic is one group with many names: IS, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, or the BBC preferred version, the Islamic State group. The name jarred with many people. President Obama explained why.
ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. And ISIL is certainly not a state. It is recognized by no government, nor by the people it subjugates. ISIL is a terrorist organization, pure and simple.
With me in the studio are our jihadist media monitoring specialist Mina Al-Lami, who regular listeners of the Global Jigsaw will be familiar with, and her teammates Barry Marston, Alex Wright, and Jacob Boswell. Hello to you all.
Hello.
Hello.
First of all, what do you call this group among yourselves, and how do you monitor it?
In the team, we call it IS, just to make it short. But of course, as the BBC calls it, Islamic State Group, we always focus on the term group, especially on first mention, to indicate that we do not acknowledge IS's claim of being a state. So to us and to the BBC and many people around the world, it is a jihadist group, it is a militant group, an insurgent group. In our team, as the name suggests, we track and analyze jihadist messaging and propaganda online through open source outlets. We look at Salafist jihadist groups that promote the use of violence to achieve their objectives. So it's groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Our team was set up in 2006, and between us, we speak multiple languages. So our close monitoring of jihadist sources over a long period of time allows us to quickly spot trends, detect any changes in the jihadist messaging, the behavior, the narratives, and the tactics.
So before we continue to talk about the threats that the group poses today, let's have a quick overview looking back at the last 10 years and the key moments that tell the story of the Islamic State group. Here are some archive reports from the field.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi urged Muslims to join the Islamic Caliphate.
Today, the militant group ISIS posted a series of graphic photos claiming a massacre of more than 1,700 Iraqi soldiers.
This is the city of Marawi in the Philippines, or at least what's left of it. The destruction here is simply jaw-dropping. This city was held by ISIS for 5 months. They took it.
This is the road to Tikrit, the town ISIS has now seized by some accounts. All this after the prize of Mosul fell into the jihadist hands.
At a restaurant in the 11th arrondissement, an apparent drive-by shooting. At the Bataclan concert hall, more shootings and an ongoing hostage crisis.
We're hearing reports from the Yemeni capital Sana'a that at least 77 people have been killed. This is when suicide bombers struck 2 mosques during...
Terror in the heart of Tunis. Just metres from Parliament, in the middle of the day, people scramble for safety as militants take over the nearby Bardo Museum.
160 people have been killed and hundreds more have been injured in a series of explosions at churches and hotels in Sri Lanka.
In the past 10 days, tens of thousands of the minority Yazidi sect are trapped. On this flight, just about a dozen made it out. But the fear is many might not survive. Giorgol, BBC News, Sanjar Mountain.
This brings back memories, Mina. Can you give us a brief history of the group?
On the 10th of June 2014, IS captured Mosul in northern Iraq and went on to swiftly capture other Sunni Iraqi areas. It then linked them up to areas it had already taken control of in Syria across the border. On the 29th of June, the group declared itself a caliphate, rebranding as the Islamic State. It named its then leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, as caliph. In August that year, IS marched to Yazidi areas near Mosul and killed and enslaved thousands of its residents. In subsequent months, IS consolidated its cross-border so-called state, as well as declared branches in various parts of the world. It was around this time that it also started pumping out these slick propaganda videos in magazines to trumpet its so-called caliphate. And this, as many of us know, dazzled many Muslims around the world who flocked to IS territory in Iraq and Syria, hoping to be part of what they saw as history in the making. It was also around this time that IS started executing Western journalists and aid workers.
Video evidence that seems to show another American has been beheaded by the radical ISIS militants. Now, this brutality prompted the U.S. to mobilize a coalition of countries to fight IS in Iraq and Syria. IS became heavily embattled and eventually lost its key strongholds in Iraq and Syria, namely Mosul and Raqqa, by the end of 2017. But the final blow came in March 2019 when IS lost its final foothold in Syria, the village of Baghouz. Its defeat in Baghouz, where thousands of IS families and fighters had huddled, caused thousands of its followers, both civilians and combatants, to end up either dead or imprisoned in jails and detention camps. We all know, of course, the camps of Al-Hol and Al-Roj in Syria. Later that month, IS started pivoting towards Africa, where it would soon declare new branches. And finally, at that point, IS changed from being a group that controlled territory to an insurgent group engaged in a global war of attrition to wear down its enemies.
And as you said, the group dazzled many Muslims at the time and at the same time shocked the world with its particular brand of brutality. And many of us had to watch videos of this choreographed extreme cruelty as part of our work. So 10 years after the declaration of the Islamic State Caliphate, where is the group now? Should we go to you, Barry?
Well, if we'd been doing this a year ago, we'd probably have been talking about how IS was very much in the doldrums. Lower numbers of attacks, less spectacular attacks, pretty much being ignored by the international media. But things look quite different in mid-2024, where they're back on the front foot, greater levels of activity. And on top of that, we're seeing a number of attention-grabbing attacks. It's also the propaganda value that it gets from each of these blows. If I was to talk about the biggest single trend we've seen over recent years, I would argue that's the pivot towards Africa. Go back to 2018, 90% of attacks were purely in Iraq and Syria. As of last year, 60% of IS claims were from countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So really distinctive shift. And beyond that, just within the Sahel region alone, according to one metric, 50% of terrorist deaths globally were in that single part of the world where we have seen a very notable upswing in jihadist activity. So One of the really striking things you get from working in this field is how dynamic and volatile these groups can be from one year to the next, really seizing on opportunities.
Jacob, you wanted to chip in?
Yeah, so in the context of the messaging that IS is putting out about the Sahel, one of the striking things from the last year is that we've seen pictures of huge numbers of fighters, often on motorcycles, parading across large open plains in daylight. It's all adding to this image of IS being able to act with impunity, out of the reach of the law.
What about the birthplace of the Islamic State group, Iraq and Syria? At one point, they ruled over 10 million people. How strong are they now there?
Not as strong as you might think. We've seen this steady drop in activity, particularly in Iraq. It's not just that the numbers of attacks have fallen, but relatively minor incidents on most occasions.
So Syria until this year was very similar to Iraq. However, this year we saw a reverse in fortunes for IS. The group's attacks there have increased from an average of 10 attacks per month last year to an average of 30 attacks. And of course, for IS, Syria is very significant. Not only was it the birthplace, along with Iraq, of IS's caliphate, but also you have the camps and the prisons that hold IS fighters and families, IS-linked women and children, and that will continue to be a very important point for IS. We also know that most, it seems, of IS's central leaders, or the so-called caliphs, were all found and killed in Syria. So we do know that Syria continues to present a really important arena for IS. In Syria, there is still an ongoing conflict. It is divided amongst different powers. And of course, IS will exploit any security vacuums and power control amongst these groups.
So this is a very challenging situation for the Islamic State group in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria. And Barry painted a picture of this organization now operating again on a truly global scale. And Barry, you mentioned its pivot to Africa after the group lost its Middle East bases. Why Africa? What's the appeal for them there? Jacob, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I guess the quick answer is that Africa offers some easy wins for IS in the sense that there are existing conflicts and Islamist groups, jihadist groups that can be co-opted and have been co-opted. I think the Sahel is a really good example of that. So we're talking about Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, and in particular the trans-border region between those three countries. It's a region that has seen tremendous insecurity and instability over the last few years, especially since 2020, when there was a coup in Mali and another coup in Niger last year. The upshot of all of this has been continuous weak governance, a withdrawal of US troops in Niger and UN peacekeepers in Mali. And this has enabled IS to make gains, especially in Mali. So last year, they went on a kind of counteroffensive against their main jihadist rival, Al-Qaeda, and ended up encircling a major town in the east of Mali. And then since the coup last year in Niger have amounted a few quite high-profile mass casualty attacks against Niger military. And there's clearly a very strong correlation between the coups and the insecurity and the activity that IS is able to carry out. And then the group has also been putting out a lot of propaganda, and a lot of these messaging, we see attempts to project IS as de facto authority. We've seen images of preaching and religious outreach. We've seen Sharia law being carried out. And so the aim of all of this is to draw some kind of continuity between the heyday of the caliphate and now, which is a way to play to IS's global audience, but also to encourage recruits on the ground.
Listening to you, it reminded me that we've done a few episodes on the Russian mercenary group Wagner and their exploits in Africa. And it's interesting that there are certain parallels and the aims might be different, but they seem to go for the same places, same countries to exploit the power and security vacuum, as you were saying. And interestingly, they end up fighting each other. And that might be one of the reasons why Russia, not just the Western world, is a target, as we've seen with the recent attack in Moscow.
When IS came out actually in a leadership message and talked about it, it was a bit annoyed, saying, why is everyone asking us why Russia? Of course, Russia. So for them, it's Russia's military involvement from years ago in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, and of course, more recently in Syria, and then in Mali through the Wagner Group and other conflict areas where jihadists are also active. So for them, it was, of course, of course we would target Russia. It's a key enemy. Moscow, it was an opportunity. They happen to have operatives there who are capable, who are willing.
Over to you, Barry.
You could argue that IS is deeply opportunistic. And if IS was to come up with a top 20 list of places or countries it would likely be wanting to hit, then probably obscure parts of Niger or Mozambique wouldn't be there at the top. It picks these areas because they are undergoverned spaces with chronic conflict. That's why we've seen Yemen, Libya, Syria, from time to time being real hubs for IS or jihadist activity. You now have the conflict in Sudan, and we have zero evidence of jihadists active in Sudan itself, but you can imagine them sitting on the sidelines thinking, well, how do we exploit this conflict? Are there local groups we could link up with? They will exploit any given vacuum, any given conflict situation, and get a foothold and gradually expand their capabilities on the ground.
So when we focus just on Africa for the moment, where else is the group active on the continent, and how have they managed to establish that foothold? Alex, I think this is your area.
Okay, so apart from West Africa and the Sahel, IS has two other major branches in Africa. One located in northeastern Mozambique and the other in northeastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. IS has co-opted pre-existing insurgent groups in these countries. In the DRC, IS originates from a group called the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces. They're a group of Muslim Ugandan rebels which have established a presence in the area over the past 3 decades. In Mozambique, the insurgency originates from a group of rebels known locally as Al-Shabaab, not related to the Somali group of the same name. Both of these groups were co-opted by IS in around 2019 at the same time as they were losing their foothold in Syria and Iraq. IS has stepped up its operations in Cabo Delgado province.
Nossa viagem informativa na província de Cabo Delgado, onde terroristas atacaram
There's been a significant raid on a major town, Macomia. It comes as troops from Rwanda and several southern African countries have been withdrawing. 70% of IS attacks this year have targeted Christian communities. These village raids have forced tens of thousands to flee, and they have been very brutal, including beheadings and the burnings of churches and homes.
I can maybe come in on ISWAP, which is the acronym for IS West African Province. It's the most prolific branch in terms of attacks, and it has been for some years. It started consolidating its presence in the northeast of Nigeria in 2021, where it was kind of fighting against its rival Boko Haram, and essentially got the upper hand, but the rivalry continues. In 2022, it staged many big attacks across the country, probably the most high profile of which was a prison break it carried out in Abuja, the capital.
It's also important to know that IS has called Africa the land of migration and urged Muslims worldwide to join its branches there. However, we haven't really seen any evidence of this taking place at the moment.
And you're talking about these branches, so many branches scattered across continents. How does this function as one entity, as one global network? Are these local branches functioning like franchises? Where is HQ? And is everybody reading from the same spreadsheet of objectives?
That's a really interesting question, because certainly in the early days, you had a very strong centre that was putting out funding and reaching out to these local groups and able to provide training and support. As the centre has progressively weakened over the years, several of these branches are growing stronger and more powerful. They have their weapons, they have incredible amounts of manpower, and that begs the question, for how long can the tail wag the dog? But the thing is that the centre gives these groups legitimacy. And by being able to claim that they are part of this global jihad movement, they are all part of this same goal. For example, at the beginning of this year, in the context of their campaign on the Gaza issue, we saw Malian jihadists firing off rockets with "This is revenge for the Muslims of Gaza" written on the side of them, in order to build themselves into this supposedly global movement. It's that degree of legitimacy that they're able to gain from portraying themselves as part of this worldwide movement.
So where is this nerve centre, this command centre that gives out the instructions?
IS runs a very centralized top-down media operation whereby all claims and messages and statements and propaganda come out through one single outlet or pipeline. And the group tries to do that in order to control the message and the brand so that there aren't any wayward narratives or messages coming out of this branch or tactics from that branch. So I think this media operation that it still runs is really important to project that image of unity, of centralization, that they're in control. In terms of where is the nerve center or the core leadership, it's difficult for us to say, but it seems just based on the number of so-called caliphs who were killed, it does seem like the majority of them continue to be in Syria.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring.
Well, France has joined the US and the UK in confirming that the attack was carried out by a branch of the so-called Islamic State group in Afghanistan, known as ISIS-K. Just last week, German police arrested 2 suspected members of the group. Now, German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser has warned that ISIS-K poses Germany's greatest Islamist threat.
We've been hearing a lot this year about ISKP or ISIS-K. What is this branch and why has it been in the news? What kind of a threat does it pose, Mina?
So ISKP is an acronym for Islamic State Khorasan Province, and Khorasan mostly refers to IS's activity in Afghanistan and northwest Pakistan. The group was set up in 2015 and it mostly poached militants from the Taliban. And after some setbacks, it launched a big campaign in August 2021 as the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. ISKP considers the Taliban its key enemy or rival. The reason that ISKP has been in the news is it first started with this concern in Europe that ISKP was broadening its activities and branching out. And then this year, it became more of a scare. You read the name ISKP in many headlines. It was with the attacks in Iran, Russia, and Turkey.
İstanbul'da terör örgütü DAEŞ'in Horasan yapılanmasına yönelik 12 sanıklı iddianame.
Now, although ISKP did not claim responsibility for these attacks, IS said we were behind the attacks, but it did not assign the Afghanistan branch as responsible. Nevertheless, many countries, authorities, and analysts speculated that ISKP was behind these attacks.
A really interesting trend that we've been following since last year was a very significant focus on Central Asian audiences. The Moscow attack perhaps saw some of this come to roost with the fact that Central Asians were so key, apparently, to this operation. Our understanding is that IS saw an opportunity here because it's so easy for Central Asians to move across the borders into Russia and to Turkey. Being able to mobilise and recruit people within these populations seems to have allowed them to broaden their reach across the region.
And Barry, you were saying earlier that after a lull of IS activities, 2024 started very differently. What prompted this reverse, in addition to these kind of opportunistic moments that they seized?
There's a whole succession of reasons. The Gaza conflict is one area where we've seen them trying to make hay in propaganda terms, try and capitalise on Muslim anger. But also in some of the countries we look at that local level, what's going on. There's several countries we've seen the withdrawal or the redeployment of peacekeepers that creates the opportunity, that creates a vacuum in order for IS to come in. The outbreak of the Gaza conflict from the 7th of October was arguably a moment for us when, after a very quiet year, we suddenly saw a very significant upsurge in jihadist propaganda from both those affiliated with IS and Al-Qaeda. And they see an opportunity here after a period where they perhaps struggled to recruit around the world.
I think we also shouldn't undermine the significance, at least the propaganda value for IS, that this is the 10th anniversary of their so-called Caliphate Declaration. And the leadership made a big deal of the anniversary, and they were trying to take advantage of the attacks that IS carried out in Iran and Moscow, and the message was after the Moscow attacks. He said this year IS is growing stronger and expanding on the back of these big attacks. So I think the anniversary also might play a role in, for the group trying really hard to reverse its setbacks that it experienced last year.
So the group managed to pull off these attention-grabbing large-scale attacks. What is your conclusion? Is it a genuinely relevant organization now?
IS, through its propaganda, of course, it will always exaggerate its threat and its strength. So it pushes out claims of attacks since Trump declared its defeat, but the majority of them have been small attacks. Sometimes it experiences setbacks and it's very quiet, and then it surges again. So I think we ignore IS at our own peril. And if we look at the example of its predecessor, the Islamic State of Iraq, with the US surge in 2007. By 2010, it was left for dead. And then 2013, it staged a number of prison breaks in Iraq that replenished its ranks. And then a year later, it went on to declare a caliphate. So I think looking at that example, which IS, by the way, often romanticizes a desert, what it means by the desert is it's fine to be pushed to remote areas. We will manage to rebound eventually.
And IS craves relevance. So this resurgence of Western attention and the focus back to a degree on IS, you see the group feeding off that and, oh, look, the West are scared of us. And look, we've put out this poster making threats and it's being covered by the media. There's that danger that this is self-feeding.
Jacob, you wanted to chip in?
I guess one thing that hasn't really changed over the last year is the bitter rivalry between Al-Qaeda and IS. And to some extent, that rivalry is degrading both groups and their capacities, especially in the Sahel. I think the main point is that Al-Qaeda, certainly in the Sahel, is keeping IS's capacities in check and kind of constantly degrading. So there's a lot of skirmishes and clashes that we see on a almost weekly basis or monthly basis.
Jihadists often seem much more capable of killing each other than the military forces in the area. You see the same thing in the Lake Chad region, where dozens of rival faction fighters have been killed in these very bloody attacks for control of the Lake Chad area.
I remember one moment talking about the rivalry between Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. It was years ago when Al-Qaeda released outtakes. These are scenes that weren't included in an Islamic State video. And why they did this is to mock them, because they're supposed to look menacing and frightening. And one of them couldn't get his words right, so everybody was laughing. Is this kind of dynamic continuing of mockery between the two groups?
They do hate each other and they do try to undermine each other online. And as you mentioned, in the past, they used to put out these GIFs or these videos to mock them. You had the one where IS militants were in a pickup truck, I think, and they just seemed very clumsy and they didn't know how to kind of hold the gun, or they were shooting it in the wrong direction. And of course, those kinds of videos really anger IS. And, you know, we had something I remember, they called them the Vimto group. It was Al-Qaeda in Yemen, where they exposed an IS video that was showing, apparently IS showing attacks against their enemies. And then they were showing Vimto, which is a cordial drink that's dark red. And it showed IS militants actually using Vimto instead of blood and staging these attacks and the impact of these attacks. And for days, it was a meme and IS was a mockery over that. So this is kind of the lighter side of how they try to undermine each other. But on the ground, they are engaged in very serious combat.
Let's think about the future. What does the future hold? What are the biggest potential threats from IS? Alex?
IS's leadership has called for attacks on large crowds. Pro-IS media outlets that have been citing attacks on major sporting events around the world, in particular football and cricket tournaments taking place this summer. They have also highlighted the contrast between holding big sporting events amid the ongoing suffering of civilians in Gaza. We still haven't seen any of these threats materialize, but a man was arrested in France on suspicion of plotting an attack against a football stadium. We've also seen security forces taking these threats very seriously and ramping up security.
Jacob, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I come back to the topic I was talking about earlier, Africa, and especially the Sahel. Security vacuums is going to really dictate to what extent IS can exploit the opportunities in those countries, especially as we see joint operations between Sahelian governments and Wagner, the Russian mercenary group, tend to focus on mineral-rich areas, which leaves, of course, pockets of completely insecure areas. And there's no UN peacekeepers in Mali anymore. Soon there'll be no US troops in Niger. So with these troops being drawn down and Wagner and the governments focusing on particular areas, it's likely that we'll see continued vacuums in certain parts of the countries.
Your tuppence, Minna.
Of course, the camps in Syria, such as Al Roj and Al Hol, as well as prisons in Hasaka in Syria that hold IS-linked fighters and families, that will continue to be, I think, a threat in terms of IS trying to stage attacks to raid these places and free prisoners or take revenge by attacking the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces that run these facilities. The IS leadership message this year again made a very emphatic call to drop everything and prioritize trying to free the women and the children and the fighters in these camps. This is a very thorny subject for IS because when these women and children and the fighters were left in Baghouz and then the IS leadership fled, these people were left to fend for themselves.
Just a mile away, IS true believers meet their apocalypse. Go film the men, they scream. We are the women of the Islamic State. God is great, as they attack our camera.
At the time, IS's jihadist rivals rebuked IS leadership and they say, how could you leave your women and children to be imprisoned like that? So for IS, it was a moment of shame. They want to reverse, or they want to at least be seen as trying to address. And actually, one of the biggest attacks that IS carried out since it's lost its caliphate was in Syria in January 2022, when it raided the Rouayran prison in Hasaka. It didn't work, but the propaganda value, I think that was significant.
Okay, and finally to you, Barry.
Well, both in 2003 and 2014, one of the sort of frightening lessons from history is how fast these groups can reconstitute themselves, mobilize, recruit large numbers of disenfranchised individuals. Go back to 2010, IS or Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time was considered to have been fought almost to extinction. And I remember very earnest discussions around 2011 and the Arab Spring about how Al-Qaeda become totally irrelevant and the Middle East is going to become democratic and we're not going to have a problem with extremism anymore. Very, very quickly, in the lead up to 2014, IS was able to capture very large amounts of territory across Syria and then move across pretty much a third of Iraq. IS would like to see itself coming back in a similar way again, using, for example, the grievances around the Gaza issue in order to radicalise large numbers of people. This is why there can't be complacency with addressing these groups, because the fortunes can turn around so fast.
And Mina, you mentioned earlier that the Islamic State group has always had a very developed, sophisticated propaganda machine. I'm just wondering, because everybody in the media nowadays is talking about artificial intelligence. Is that something they have noticed?
So in terms of IS's media operation, it is definitely a shadow of its former self. It used to pump out regularly these big propaganda videos, very slick, high-quality production values, presenters that sound very professional. These days, actually, a propaganda video, official one from IS, is quite rare. So the group has increasingly been relying on its army of online supporters and media groups, and these amplifying and disseminating the IS messages and repackaging them. So one of the recent developments was one media group put together a video that was made up of IS's claims. So IS has written, as you can imagine, they're not as exciting as a video or, something with a soundtrack. And they repackaged it as a succession of news bulletins that was read out by an animated presenter, all AI created.
And are there any ethical considerations for them at all? Because everybody in the media is discussing, can we use it? What can we use it for? What is an appropriate way to use it? Are they having any issues with the fact that it's fake, for example?
So I think with the bad guys, they don't have the same qualms about ethical issues, so they would run with it. But of course, there are issues for these jihadist groups related more to anything that contravenes, as they see, Sharia guidelines. So even with that AI video that I mentioned, it received a backlash from some hardline supporters of IS because the presenter had facial features. For hardline jihadists, they say it is forbidden in Islam to depict humans or animals in drawings or sculptures. It's haram. So the producer of the series had to reproduce them and remove the facial features of the presenter, which just looked really weird and awkward for a presenter not to have any eyes and nose or and mouth.
It just strikes me that this is very different from the kind of videos that the Islamic State produced at the very start when they shocked the world with their cruelty.
We still see a lot of the shocking, cruel videos with the very deliberate use of shocking, explicit violence. Partly that's as a way of them promoting themselves as we are the only people who are carrying out our religious beliefs to their extremes. We're the only group that do not compromise in any sort of way. And for a certain kind of narrow mindset, that seems to work in their propaganda. They're going out to these villages that perhaps have never had significant engagement with the central state. They're exerting some sort of quasi-governance, young people receiving indoctrination and military training. So there is therefore a new generation that is being inculcated within the IS movement. It's this projection of continuity, of the ability to sort of move forward in the future and continue to stay relevant.
You hear a lot of people who joined IS and then repented and said, we didn't know, we only saw the soft messaging, the lush parks, the education. I think from day one, the violence and brutality went hand in hand with soft messaging. And what they hope to do through that is scare the local population and the local security forces so that when IS militants arrive to a certain region, the propaganda would have preceded them that would put off and scare the security forces and not let them stay put and confront IS. They have the soft messaging to some extent, the religious outreach, preaching, the preachers going out to villages, and as IS says, educating them about Islam, giving them medical aid. There's that, but there's also the brutality. It doesn't negate it.
So how significant is it that they are now turning to AI to generate these propaganda messages?
It is worrying just because of the potential of AI, of how much it could help them to put out more messages quicker in different languages. God knows what other formats they could use AI to produce the propaganda. But I think it's still early days, and I think at the moment it's the supporters that are experimenting with AI. So it remains to be seen what IS itself will do with AI, if anything.
Thank you to our contributors Mina Al-Lami, Barry Marston, Alex Wright and Jacob Boswell. This episode was produced by Krista Shaturi and Elchin Suleimanov. Studio production was by Graham White, it was mixed by Nick Scripps and edited by Judy King. I'm Krasi Twig.